All right, everybody. I want to make sure that this is recording. Yep, we're recording. We're live. This is probably the most technical thing I've ever tried, but we do this a lot with Com 1500, our other class. We do these online presentations, but I'm going to dive right into everything because I don't want to make this video really, really long. So organizational information theory is a theory that deals with how organizations tackle information problems, various things that happen. The theory loosely reminds me of uncertainty reduction theory, which we studied a while back, except on a bigger scale. Uncertainty reduction dealt with how individuals deal with uncertainty. Organizational information theory deals with how businesses deal with uncertainty. Except instead of calling it uncertainty in this chapter, it's called equivocality. It's a different word, but it means the same thing. We'll get to that a little later on. But the theory was first devised by Carl E. Weick, who used the phenomenological perspective along with a school of thought called systems theory to explain how organizations manage information. The theory is seen as incredibly useful because examining how a business or group uses communication to manage information can actually help that group or business become more effective. So this theory, very practical theory, very useful for anybody that wants to make more money, which is probably as useful as you can get. Another interesting tidbit is that Kent State University's communication department partners with the information science department to make what the school is known as today as the College of Communication and Information. So information science is another type of theory, and this theory combines, Carl E. Weick combined elements of what was then at the time called structure theory. Now it's evolved into information systems theory. But essentially what that means is nobody in the 1960s had ever looked at businesses from a communication perspective. Carl E. Weick was the first person to look at businesses from the communication perspective. What is the communication process that an organization uses to deal with confusing information? He was the first one to come up with this idea. So it's also sort of like information theory. The difference with information theory, it's focused on how people deal with information. With communication theory, you're more concerned about communication is the primary factor. How do people communicate? So this is a combination theory. How do people use information is the peanut butter. How people communicate is the jelly. And you make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich of communication and information. That describes this theory. So another idea that was applied to this theory is Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. So I posted some pictures here. This is my favorite, young Charles Darwin with sideburns. Then you have old Charles Darwin, and then old Charles Darwin with a hat. But this is the guy who came up with the theory of evolution. And what Weick decided was that the theory of evolution could be applied to the business world in two ways. So the theory of socio-cultural evolution is the idea that only the strongest survive, survival of the fittest, and this idea was applied to the business world. So one factor he identified is that people who work, employees, people who work a job, adapt to the jobs that they have or the roles that they play in an organization. So people adapt their behavior and their social lives to fit the need of an organization. You may think of this as if you have a job, what are some ways that you've changed who you hang out with, what you do socially, how have you modified stuff like your sleep schedule to fit this particular job? I know that my job as a professor has defined a lot of my life, and my other job as a disc jockey also sort of defines what I do on the weekends. So as people, we change to meet the needs of our organization. The other idea with the concept, I should say, of evolution is that businesses evolve to meet information needs. So, for example, the reason I was hired at Kent State University was to deal with a huge number of students enrolling as communication majors. So, in essence, Kent State evolved to deal with the information need of more students. Another school example, is that more and more students want to be able to take classes online. So Kent State and many other schools have evolved or changed to meet that need by offering more classes online. So the businesses that can deal with confusing information survive. The businesses that can't deal with confusing information fail. That is the idea behind evolution. Socio-Cultural Evolution, and Organizational Information Theory. I found this image. I thought it was interesting. This kind of talks about 4 different types of confusion. You have ambiguity, equivocality, uncertainty, and complexity. And specifically with organizational information theory, we deal with equivocality. The most important aspect of organizational information theory is equivocality. Equivocality is how confused an organization gets about the messages it receives. So this is why I mentioned again earlier that organizational information theory is like a larger version of uncertainty reduction theory. It's uncertainty on a bigger scale. So as I pointed out, this image shows the difference between ambiguous, equivocal, uncertain, and complex messages. So it's interesting to note the slight differences in the confusion behind each type of message, but you don't need all 4 separate definitions for the exam. What's important is to make a note of the fact that any kind of confusing message, whether it's complex, uncertain, ambiguous, or equivocal, those are all different types of confusion that any organization is going to have to deal with. And so now we'll talk about first some assumptions this theory makes, and then how organizations deal with confusing information. And then we're done with all the material for today. So organizations exist in an information environment where they get equivocal or confusing messages, and then they have to deal with them. I kind of took all 3 assumptions that the textbook used and smashed them into one. So this is a pretty straightforward definition. Most organizations deal with information all the time. They deal with confusing messages, and you're not really stretching or going out on a limb to say that businesses do this, because this is a fact that this happens a lot. But it's interesting to think about, okay, what types of businesses don't necessarily deal with this as much? Where is this theory not as important or not as strong? So an organization where members act independently and don't get together that often might be one exception, or an organization that doesn't encounter a great deal of new information. Maybe organizations that have been around longer might just be doing the same things and not need to change as much. So that's a counter idea, something that might violate the assumptions. But essentially, this theory makes some straightforward assumptions that aren't too hard to think of as being too outrageous. Anyway, now we're going to talk about the actual process of organizational information and what goes on. How do organizations deal with confusing messages? The first way is rules. And this is some rules. Any organization decides, how are we going to respond to a confusing message or a problem? They come up with a couple of rules. So Weick observed that organizations tend to pick solutions that happen quickly, which is a duration rule, solutions that put the most knowledgeable workers in charge, which is a personnel rule, solutions that rely on strategies that have worked before, which is a success rule, and finally, my favorite, solutions that take the least amount of work, which is an effort rule. And myself, I always pick the easiest solutions because I'm pretty lazy. Effort rule is my favorite. So next up, the other way that organizations deal with information other than rules is actually through a communication process. And the communication processes to reduce confusion or to reduce equivocality are known as cycles. So I came up with a little script here. Workers or someone will ask a question, raise a concern, or otherwise call attention to the information problem by acting. This is the first reaction someone has. Experts or other members in the organization will respond to the question or concern with a response. If the question is answered and the problem is solved, everyone in the organization now knows how to respond and does so by adjusting in the adjustment step. So those are the first 3 steps. And finally, if they are still confused, they might ask another question or act, at which point we start the cycle again. So you go through this as a sort of loop, over and over and over, act, response, adjustment, until the problem gets fixed. And finally, the double interact loop refers to this 3-step process when it repeats itself. And in real life, when you're going through this process over and over again, this is reviews, meetings, interviews, meeting with each individual employee to see how they're doing. We do assessments for our basic COM 1500 class that is like a double interact loop. So organizations with good management, or one that cycle effectively, according to this theory, are the ones that reduce more confusing messages. So this is any kind of communication that's going to reduce any kind of uncertainty is known as a cycle. Just to review, the rules you have in place or procedures with how you're going to deal with problems also help to reduce uncertainty. So you have rules and cycles. So when we look and we zoom out, if you will, and we look at organizational information theory as a big process, these are the things, 4 steps that you go through to reduce uncertainty, to reduce equivocality, if you will. Enactment is where individuals in an organization first encounter equivocal information. So first is enactment. We have some confusing equivocal information. The next step is sense making, where the organization tries to be as aware as possible to make sure that it has all of the confusing information. And this is so the sense making step. Other scholars are really proud of Weick for coming up with this idea of sense making, because information happens and occurs and stuff gets confusing really quickly. So a lot of times you don't have all the information coming in at one time. So once you discover something's a problem with enactment, he put in this second stage, which is sense making, which really shows that life is pretty complex. Getting confusing information is a complex problem. So you're dealing with things as they come in, and you have to make sense of that information. So the third step is what we just talked about, selection. That's where an organization picks what rules and what cycles will be used in the equivocality reduction process. So the whole process of selection is this step: rules, then cycles. That's the selection step. Finally, after the problem's been dealt with, you have the retention step. So in other words, the organization will remember what rules and cycles worked versus those that were less effective, and use this information to deal with future equivocal messages. And Weick says that every organization has a collective memory of what worked, what didn't work. Every organization has a history, and they use this to reduce uncertain messages that they get in planning any sort of communication, enacting in day-to-day business. You have experience that organizations build up as well. So just generally in closing, this is my last slide. But again, this theory looks at communication processes, but not the communicators themselves. So this isn't an individual level theory. This is more of a mid-range theory that is looking at the entire process an organization goes through. So you yourself working at a job, you would not use this theory to explain anything you did. You would use this theory to explain how well did the business, how well did the company, how well did your organization deal with an information problem or an information need. So that's one thing to remember. It's targeted at organizations, not people. But the one big takeaway from this whole thing is the idea of equivocality, that organizations deal with uncertain messages through a certain process, and that's the general idea behind organizational information theory. I'm also going to post some discussion questions to the Blackboard page. I will link to that as well on the Blackboard page in case you want to discuss this online, which I'm excited for. And thanks for listening.